Hi, and welcome to PIIE Insider Live. I'm Anjali Bhatt, Communications Manager and Research Fellow here at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I often say that one of my favorite parts of my job is that I can just walk into the offices of some of the world's top economic experts and just ask them questions, and then they answer. So with PIIE Insider Live, you get to come with me to ask those questions and get those answers. Today, we're speaking with the iconic Chad Bown, Reginald Jones Senior Fellow here at PIIE, and host of the popular podcast Trade Talks, which recently returned from hiatus. And it was on hiatus because Chad was off being the chief economist at the US State Department from 2023 to 2024. So it's also kind of a welcome back to PIIE. Before we start, if you're watching on Zoom, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. And also, Chad and I will not be checking our phones for the next half hour. So if any trade policy changes happen in this time, no, it didn't. Hi, Chad. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Anj.
All right, let's just get into it, right? With the tariffs, what is happening, and also, are you okay?
Yeah, I think I'm surprisingly good, better than expected. There've been a lot of tariffs. The last few weeks have been nutty. The last few months have been crazy, but no, for me, things are great. But thank you for asking.
So where are we with the tariffs right now? We have what, 10% on most imports, 25% on cars and some other stuff, and then very high tariffs on China. Is that broadly right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so there are a lot of tariffs out there, and part of what we do is to kind of keep track of them. I guess the way I try to keep track of them is by seeing them through the eyes of how they might affect real world people, Americans especially. I mean, tariffs affect people everywhere, but so maybe let me give you two examples of things that I've been tracking that I think are important, but also that have been confused maybe by the media reporting and the White House announcements of what's been happening, because there has been a lot of chaos out there. So maybe the first one is smartphones. Gosh, we don't have our smartphones with us at the moment. You said, right? We're not checking. So smartphones, right? Everybody remembers back to the first Trump administration. President Trump also liked tariffs and imposed a lot of tariffs on a lot of different products. But at the end of the day, it was really, for the most part, only on stuff from China. And it turns out it wasn't on everything that we buy from China. And so, and in the end, what did they, we did the math at the time, tariffs on stuff coming in from China went from an average of about 3% to, almost 20%. So 16, 17% increase. But the Trump administration didn't put tariffs on things like smartphones, or, video game consoles or toys or things like that, a lot of consumer facing products. So this time around, smartphones, are smartphones being hit with tariffs or not? You mentioned the tariffs on China are really high. There are some products, 125% or more. This past weekend, there was confusion because all of the most recent tariffs that have gone on China, especially, there was a clarification that certain products that contained semiconductors, including smartphones, wouldn't be affected by those tariffs. And so people thought, okay, well, smartphones are now being exempted from this stuff, and maybe when I go to the iPhone store or whatever, we won't see.
The price won't change.
The price won't change. Yeah. But it turns out, back in the first 2 months of the administration, on February 4th and March 4th, President Trump actually did impose tariffs on everything we buy from China, including smartphones. And they weren't small tariffs either. They were 20% tariffs. And remember, the first Trump administration, the cumulative of tariffs were only 17%. Here we've got 20% tariffs on lots of new products, including smartphones. So, that's an important way, I think, that consumers this time around might say, hey, the stuff that I buy is suddenly being hit with tariffs. Before, it was primarily on things that economists call intermediate inputs. So widgets, parts that go into other things that companies use to make something else that then goes into something that you or I would buy, right? So it's much, much later in the production process that you and I actually see the effects of tariffs, and we're going to see it probably quicker this time around. So smartphones is one example where there's been confusion.
So there are still tariffs on smartphones.
There are still tariffs on smartphones, and
Okay.
they're 20%, and they're new.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to watch what the price effects actually are. A second one is cars. You mentioned the 25% tariffs on cars, and this is a really interesting one because it helps to show how complicated supply chains are, but also how complicated the details of some of these policy announcements that have come out over the last couple of months have actually been. So let's think a lot of cars that we have access to in consumers, as consumers here in the United States. A lot of them are assembled here in the United States, but a lot of them are also assembled either in Canada or Mexico. So, and it's a lot of different companies. It could be American headquartered companies like GM or Ford, or European companies like BMW or Audi or Volkswagen, or Japanese companies, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, right? So or Korean companies, Hyundai, Kia, right? They all assemble vehicles across North America, but a lot of them assemble vehicles in Canada or Mexico. But they've got a lot of parts coming in from the United States, right? They might have the engine or the transmission or something might be made in the United States by American workers, then going into Canada or Mexico, being put into the car, and then the car shipped back. Under the rules of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, this is the free trade agreement between our three countries, there are what they call rules of origin for automobiles. And it basically says, provided that 75% of the value of the content of the inputs, the engines, transmission, the steering wheel, the tires, all that value of all that stuff put together is coming from North America, it qualifies for a zero tariff. The car qualifies for a zero tariff once it goes over the border. So it's assembled in Mexico, if it's got 75% American content, it can come into the United States without a tariff on it. Okay. Well, 75% is kind of high, and that was ramped up under the first Trump administration. So it's taken a while for kind of companies to get closer and closer to meeting that 75%. And some of them just aren't quite there yet. So the alternative is, if you can't meet those qualifications, then you pay a tariff, the normal tariff that everybody else in the world pays to get their cars into the US market, which is 2.5%. So that was the state of the world in like February. But then in early March, the Trump administration said, in a kind of a fight with Canada and Mexico, they said, well, for all products, including cars, that are not compliant with the rules of origin legal elements of the USMCA, you're going to be hit with a 25% tariff. So now all of a sudden, a car that maybe was, at 74% value added, or maybe 70, but wasn't quite there, now it goes from having to pay a 25%, there's a 2.5% tariff to a 2.5 plus 25, 27.5% tariff, right? So that's a lot more. Then in early April, it gets worse, right? The president announces that there's going to be a separate 25% tariff that's going to apply to all cars, regardless of where they're coming in. So now suddenly this vehicle that was paying a 2.5% tariff in February went from 2.5% to 27.5. Now is paying a 52.5% tariff just to get into the United States.
Wow.
Wow. Okay. Now, but then some of the car companies have recognized that, and they say, an American consumer is not going to be willing to pay more than 50% more to buy this car.
Sure.
A car that used to be $20,000, that means it's $30,000, right? And consumers might not be.
That's a big difference.
That's a big difference. Yes. And so the car companies say, well, I'm not going to ship that model into the United States anymore. And so what you have is a situation where American consumers are either going to be facing higher prices for the cars that actually do come into the market because of these tariffs, and then getting passed along to them, or just not getting access to certain models anymore, right? So not getting certain varieties of cars that they could have bought 2 months ago are no longer going to be offered to them because of these tariffs. And then because of the supply chains and the way those work, the fact that a vehicle assembled at one of these plants in Canada, the transmission or the engine might be being put together at a plant in Indiana or Ohio or Michigan, right across the border there, right? Now all of a sudden, if those plants shut down those production lines because American consumers aren't going to be willing to pay more for those cars, all of a sudden the engine makers back in the United States and their workers lose their business too, right? And so those are the kinds of things that we're starting to see, I think, show up, or the stories that we're starting to be told. It's very early to be able to see this in the data, but I think these are the ways that Americans can expect to be impacted by these tariffs. Higher prices for certain things, shortages, not getting access to products that they might have had access to before, and then through these supply chains, potentially impacting their jobs and potentially affecting, their wages or income in ways that, we haven't seen. Sorry, that was very long-winded.
No,
and very
that's great.
complicated,
No,
but that's sort of
that-
the world of trade at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly, what we need. And I think especially because supply chains are so complicated, even just within North America between the three countries. But now that we have tariffs on the entire world, as well as products from China that are super high, what is that going to do for other supply chains that, outside of North America?
Yeah, and I think that's what we don't know the answer to yet, right? And so what we saw with the response to all the tariffs in the first Trump administration, that were primarily just focused on China, is eventually once companies recognized that those things looked like they were going to be there to stay, they decided to move some of their supply chains. So they adopted some of them, a China plus one strategy of saying, well, we're going to keep our production facilities in China to be able to service the Chinese market. But now, because of the tariffs the United States has on China, it's too expensive for us to be able to assemble, put together the product in China and to ship it to the United States. So we need to move that point of final assembly to somewhere else. And so you saw some of those plants being moved into places like Vietnam or Taiwan or Mexico.
But not the US.
Some probably did come to the US. I can't rule it out. It's harder to see that kind of thing in the data. And I'm sure there were some examples, but for the most part, probably not, right? For the most part, it was, a lot of labor intensive products, things that still wanted to have access to a relatively complete and sophisticated supply chain that might have been located there in Asia. And so they wanted to locate themselves relatively nearby. Yeah, but what happens this time around, we don't know. Part of the attractiveness of that as a strategy the last time was the tariffs on all those other countries, the US tariffs on Vietnam, on Taiwan, on Bangladesh, Mexico, they didn't change, right? But now, if they're going to face at best a 10% tariff, right? That's the baseline tariff the administration has imposed on everybody. It may be worse, a much higher tariffs. The president threatened and sort of withdrew higher tariffs on a lot of those countries. Maybe those supply chains don't go there. So I think that's the big challenge facing companies right now, is the uncertainty as to what the future tariff world looks like for them. And when these companies are faced with uncertainty with their supply chains, the natural response for them is to just say, we're going to wait. We're not going to make investments anywhere. We're going to hold off. And that is not good for kind of economic activity and economic growth, because you need those kinds of investments to keep the world churning.
So speaking of uncertainty, we are very familiar with that, especially because we're tracking this all here. So you have two trackers, the Trump Trade War Timeline 2.0 and the US-China Trade War Tariffs. Both of those existed in the first administration. Let's talk a little bit about that. How has tracking both the tariffs on China as well as the U.S. actions and responses in general, how has that changed from the first time around? And sort of why are we doing this?
Yeah, why are we doing
Why are you doing this?
Yeah, sometimes I wake up every day and ask myself that. Well, I think that's one of actually the most important things that I do at Peterson. But let's be clear, this is not Chad doing this. This is a team effort. There's a huge number of us that are working on this, including you, and it's something that we do collaboratively. But the underlying question is, why do we need to do it? I think we need to do it because we need to establish what the facts are about what's actually happening out there in the real world in terms of policy. And as we know, this particular president, whether it was the first administration, and this was something that we saw very early on, which is why we decided back then in 2018 to establish these trackers, there was a tendency for the president to riff and sort of say one thing
or tweet it
at the time, and then have the practical reality of the policy that was actually being imposed be very, very different. And so what we want to do is to clarify what the policy is that's actually happening in the real world.
The actual government
The
action.
actual government action,
Yeah.
right? That's what goes into the nerdy thing called the Federal Register, and
Yeah.
that's what changes the tariff rates at the, CBP, the Customs and Border Protection, when goods show up at the border and suddenly it's those things that matter, not what the president said on Truth Social or whatever, right? So what we have done is we collect all in one place in an organized fashion, all of those announcements, and try to provide links so folks can click through and to see the details of what it is that's actually happening there. And then what we try to do is so that's the point of that, is to get the facts right. You got to get the facts right.
What is actually happening.
What's actually happening, so that we can then begin the conversation, right? And you need to build trust, kind of with your audience, and you want them to believe that you're working from the right set of facts. And so by us being transparent and saying these are the facts as we understand, we're happy to correct them if we miss things, or we misinterpret things. Please correct us. It's part of our job is to kind of get the story right. But is getting the foundation correct is a very important first step, because then what we want to do is to put data to it to understand it, right? And to be able to explain to the world and then analyze it, right? And, so then we do things like, okay, well, these announcements, these executive orders have said tariffs are going to be against these countries at these rates, but these products are going to be exempted. So me and the other nerds around here, we go and we get all that information, we match it up to data, and then we try to explain to the world, well, that means this. This is how I can tell you that our best guess at the moment is the average tariff on China is 124.7%, right? And
it's not the 125 or the 145.
not the 125, 145, I've seen all kinds of numbers.
It's not that.
It's not that, right? But it's completely understandable why people think it is that, because everybody has said all of the things, right? And so our job is to try to clarify what the actual facts are in terms of the actual policy in existence.
So in Trump 1.0 on the trade war timeline, we tracked that via battles. So we had the solar panels and washing machines as one, steel and aluminum as one, IP practices were the third, and then cars were the fourth. On the 2.0 timeline, it's just kind of everything, and we're just adding, filters as we go along.
Yeah. So my guiding principle the first time around was to focus on policies that involved the president having discretion, right? There's some elements of trade policy changing that are kind of bureaucratic, that happen regardless of who the administration is. So this is things like anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties. There's kind of a separate process and track there. And we didn't want to be including that. We wanted to be, primarily focusing on things that the president had his hands over, right? He was the final decision maker. And so those were the cases in the first administration: solar panels, washing machines, steel and aluminum, the Section 301 investigation on China that led to tariffs for unfair trade practices. Those were all decisions that ultimately the president made about whether to impose tariffs or to do something else. Cars was another one that we were looking at back then too. Similar story this time around, right? It's just that there's been a lot more things to keep track of, because the president has started, is imposed tariffs under different authorities that he also, he had access to them back then, but didn't really use them. This IEEPA law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. But then we have our old favorites, the Section 232 National Security law that they've used for, again, with steel and aluminum. That's the law under which he decided to impose tariffs on cars. There's more coming on auto parts. We've got new investigations. Maybe things will happen on semiconductors, pharmaceutical products, copper, lumber. Anyway, so we've got filters there to track all of these things, but it's primarily the ones where it really is the president who's making the final decision about whether there's going to be tariffs or some other major policy action impacting trade in these areas.
And it's just a lot more.
It's a lot more, but there may be something else that comes along that we decide on a different organizing principle for how to keep people informed and to make sense of this information. But this is what we got
the
for
comms
now.
team is scared about that, but we'll do it.
We'll deal with it.
Um, okay, so let's talk a little bit about all of this merch that you have here. Trade Talks is a thing, your podcast. It's existed now for what, like seven,
Yeah,
8 years?
yeah. So,
Yeah, let's talk about Trade
let's
Talks.
talk about Trade Talks.
Yeah.
So thank you for asking. It's my labor of love. So Trade Talks, the amazing economist and journalist Samaya Keynes, who's now a columnist at the Financial Times, and I started it back in 2017. And it's a podcast about trade and the sort of economics of trade and policy. And we did it on a weekly basis back then together. And she was at the time writing about obviously the first Trump trade war every day and the various things going on at that point in time. She's since had to go off and do other things.
There are other
There
things
are other
happening in the
things.
world.
She actually hosts her own amazing podcast now for the Financial Times called The Economic Show with Samaya Keynes. Highly recommend. But Trade Talks has continued on with me. And yeah, so it's back. I obviously brought it back in February when I got back to Peterson and when the trade events started to heat up
An
again.
emergency episode.
Yeah, we had an emergency episode to kick things off, and it seems like we've had in a lot of emergency episodes.
Yeah, everyone
since.
is an emergency episode.
Yeah.
So how do you go about planning what you're going to, I mean, I guess recently especially, we've just been reacting to the trade announcements that keep coming. How do you plan what you're going to talk about and sort of map out what because I mean, you cover so much ground in each episode. How do you do that?
Yeah. So my kind of inspiration and maybe guiding principle for this is it actually goes back to when I was in college. And believe it or not, the reason why I got into trade, and really trade is all that I do, and people say that I do it too much and I should really get other things in my life. But trade is,
But here we are.
here we are. But I went down this path because trade was honestly the most difficult course that I had in college. And it was essentially something that I didn't get the first time around. And I thought to myself, wow, this seems really hard. I love it. It's so interesting, but I don't get it. And so I want to study it more, and maybe I'll get it.
That's how I feel about a lot of stuff here at Peterson.
And so that's how I kind of think about episodes too, right? If it's something that's obvious, people don't need to know about it. But most of the time, I pick a topic because it's something that I don't understand yet, and I really, really want to understand it, and I want to force myself to come to grips with it. And so that's sort of how I identify what to work on. If it's something that's straightforward, then there's very little value there to understanding it, to covering it. And so I pick things that are interesting to me, but also I don't quite get. That's where we sort of start.
That's such a solid.
Aside from the news, right?
Yes,
Which then,
yeah.
The news stuff is also something that I don't understand, where I feel like I need to understand it too, and hopefully will provide a clarification of certain elements to the world. But
so, I mean, so you mentioned, we had this emergency episode when you came back to Peterson you came back in January.
January 21st. Yeah.
Yeah. But you were at the State Department for a year before then. What was that like? And especially this really is something I have wanted to ask you, is what is like interesting about working in government in that way that, someone like me or, our viewers wouldn't, consider or know about?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, getting to work in government is the most, humbling and, I don't know it's just an honor, right? To be able to work in government and to do public service. The State Department for me was very new. I think back again to college. And when I was in college, it was right at the moment when the Soviet Union was kind of breaking up and dissolving. And I hit a fork in the road and was thinking about maybe I want to become a diplomat. Maybe I didn't, I loved to study language. My mom was a Spanish teacher. And so I loved languages. I was like, maybe I'll go study Russian. And we've been in this Cold War thing for 50 years. Maybe I'll go do that. That'll be my career. Or maybe I'll do the exact opposite of that and go get a PhD in economics. So I was at that fork in the road, and I chose the one that I chose and did the trade thing. But I've always had this just amazing appreciation of diplomacy and stuff. So when the State Department called, it was sort of a no-brainer. I mean, obviously working in government is a huge honor, but when the State Department called, it was
I mean, that
something
must have been
special.
such a phone call.
Yeah, and it was really an incredible experience too. So, I mean, my entire research career, I don't really study why trade exists. What I study and what I research and what I'm really focused on is why countries get along and don't get along, where there's cooperation and when there's conflict in the space of international trade. And right at that edge, right, that's sort of where I'm most comfortable, is where others are most uncomfortable. So it was fascinating being in government, working in a job where that was my job. Now, luckily in that administration, they were very much focused on the cooperation part, right? Maybe a little bit different today, where they're less focused, at least at the moment, on the cooperation part and more on the conflict part. But then it was, how are we going to do new and fundamentally transformative and important things with partners and allies involving trade and supply chains, but in a cooperative way, that we've never done it before, right? And so getting to work at the forefront of that and getting to travel around the world and work with counterparts in Europe, in Asia, in Tokyo and Seoul and Manila and Ho Chi Minh, was the experience of a lifetime. So yeah,
Cool.
yeah, it was really cool. And it's basically I recommend to any time you get a chance to work in government, it's just a hugely valuable experience to have, because also it brings tremendous value to the future thinking that you have to do about, well, what research things should I work
Noted. We're almost at time, but we've got a couple questions here. One of our audience questions says, given sort of a longer view, how likely do you think it is that the world will break up into distinct trading blocks, each increasingly isolated from each other? And if that is likely, what would those blocks look like?
on? Yeah, I am very worried about that. I'm very concerned about the trajectory that China is taking in particular. Right now, everybody's focused on what the Trump administration is doing, and for good reason. But I think that's a little bit unfortunate, because there is a real challenge out there about the path that China has chosen to go down, I think, over the last decade or so, maybe, which was very different from what the expectations were when it initially came into the WTO in, say, 2001. And there is a concern that unless and until China and the United States, Europe, the other major economies out there that do represent these blocks can get together and to start talking to each other in fundamental ways that haven't been there yet about what the disagreements are in the trade space and in the economic system space, right? China's a very different kind of economy than we operate in the United States or Europe, these Western oriented democracies. Until we can start to have those direct conversations and figure that out, the world, I think, is going to move in that direction. And I do find that.
So, also taking a longer view as we wrap up here, what in general will you be watching for in the next few months? We are going to keep updating all of the trackers, as all the time.
All the time.
But besides the trackers, what will you be looking for?
Yeah. I mean, I think what's really interesting at the moment is to watch how other countries and their governments are responding to the crisis that the Trump administration has brought on deliberately with the tariff actions, right? They did this because they wanted to provoke these other countries to do something. So we've just this week had the first country, Japan, the Japanese government came through and we're involved with talks with the Trump administration, and we'll wait and see what that leads to, right? Is it that they're just talking about trade related things? Is it that the administration wants Japan to buy more LNG, or I don't know, ship fewer cars or something, or is this being tied to other stuff, national security stuff, right? There have been reports about the administration wanting the Japanese government to pay more for essentially the American troops that are stationed there in Asia. So what is this all about, right? The Trump administration has provoked this moment to get countries to come to the table, but what does that mean, and how are these other governments going to respond? Japan, Europe, similar story. Obviously, with the Russia-Ukraine conflict going on there, that's a very, very important one for us to keep track of. Canada, they have an election, April 28th.
Oh, it's soon.
It's very
Wow.
soon, yeah. And so we're going to have to see. So they're kind of in a holding pattern at the moment until they have their election. So we'll have to see what the new government is going to be. We've got the USMCA review that's coming up anyway with the U.S., Canada, and Mexico on trade related issues, and then obviously China, right? And again, I don't think this is a U.S. China thing. I think this is more of a China rest of the world thing. But maybe if the Trump administration is going to be the one taking the lead with China on that, what is this going to look like? What is China's perspective going to be on? Anyway, there's a lot to be watching.
Yeah, so what other governments are going to be doing and what those relationships with the US are going to become. Yeah. Okay, well, we are at time. Chad, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all for joining us for this edition of PIIE Insider Live. What did you think? What do you want to see next? Let us know at meetings@PIIE.com. And if you're not already, subscribe to PIIE Insider, the newsletter, at PIIE.com/subscribe. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.